All right, welcome everyone to the second to the last seminar of this season. Today we have Anastassia Vybornova. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Copenhagen Center for Social Data Science. And she recently, if I'm not wrong, received her PhD in urban data science, and she has a background in technical physics, transcultural communication, and environmental science. So she is definitely an interdisciplinary researcher. And her current research is dedicated to the intersection of social and spatial networks, which is what she's going to talk about today. So today's talk is going to be about a recent paper that was published in PNAS. And yeah, she's gonna I'm particularly stoked for this research. And she also, like, during her leisure time, enjoys community organization and micro movements and of solidarity. And yeah, she's such a great person. I know her personally as well. So I'm really happy to have you here. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, please take it away. Oh, also, we will have like pretty much 45 minutes for your talk, and then plus 10 minutes for questions, unless you want to take the questions on the go. But yeah, whatever you prefer, I guess. Okay. Yeah, just take it away.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation, Gülşah, and everyone else. I'm really happy to be here. Also, thanks for putting the seminar series together. I think that's really cool. I'll start by trying to remove this message that I'm seeing on my screen here. Just a second. Okay, I got it. I can go back to... Okay, I think now everything is under control again, right? Okay. So yes, my name is Anastassia, and I'm currently at the University of Copenhagen, as Gülşah mentioned. But the work I'm going to be presenting here happened mostly when I was still doing my PhD that I recently finished at the IT University of Copenhagen, so not that far away in the same city, at a research group called NERDS, which stands for Networks, Data, and Society. And in particular, so the network science part of my PhD, I think it really came to a kind of a culmination in the work that I'm going to be presenting today, which is titled Urban Highways Are Barriers to Social Ties, which is already a claim in itself, which we're going to unpack. And this is work with several colleagues that I'm going to be mentioning later on as well. So really like a long effort, very much interdisciplinary and also across institutions. And it took us a couple of years to really get to the place that we finally got. So yeah, I'm really happy to also present that, in my opinion, also really cool research project here. And yeah, so the paper recently got out in PNAS. There's the link there. I think it's behind a paywall. So if you want the actual PDF, you're very welcome to write me if you don't have like an institutional subscription to that. And the work we've been doing together, so with Luca, who was the main author, who's also at the IT University of Copenhagen, and Michael, who was my PhD supervisor, and then Shandor and Esther, two by now also friends of ours who are respected. Shandor is at the university in Budapest, Corvinus University, and Esther is at the University of Amsterdam. And I also mentioned them in particular because the work that they have done before with some of the data sets we've been using really predates this work actually by a decade or so. So it's really a very long process of not only making the paper, but also conceiving all the ideas and all this data pre-processing that actually led to the final outcome here. So yes, how did it all come together? I'll start by a very simple intuition, and we're talking about highways in urban places. The simple intuition being that wherever there's a highway, which is a physical infrastructure that is very difficult to cross by foot, this highway actually is a physical barrier to people moving around, unless, of course, they move by car, then it's nice when you're in a car, you can go along the highway and you maybe can get much faster from A to B. But when you're actually on the ground and moving around by foot or with public transport or on a bicycle, then a highway actually represents a physical barrier that is hard to overcome. And then there's this idea that when there are physical barriers between places where people live, that this might have an impact on the social connections that people can form. So that the physical setup of our environment, and especially in cities, somehow must have an impact on the social fabric of a city. This is not our idea, like this is not a new idea. This has been really kind of in the making as a concept and as an understanding in urban studies and in sociology and so on So people really for a long time have been talking about how the physical environment influences the social environment. And in particular in cities, when you have infrastructural barriers and like really physical barriers within a city, that this must have some effect on the social structure as well. And there have been a couple of studies looking into this quantitatively, but the really cool thing I think about this project here is that for the first time, we really did a large scale analysis of testing this hypothesis on the level of data on individual connections between people. And I'll get a bit more into detail on what exactly I mean by that. But just to be clear what the hypothesis here is. So you see these two people in the frame on the right. And let's say this is you and me, and I live on the one side of a highway and you live on the other side of a highway. And then the question is the fact that there's a highway between us, does this somehow impact the likelihood of the two of us becoming friends or being somehow otherwise socially connected in real life? So this is the hypothesis. And as I mentioned, of course, for many decades, researchers have kind of agreed on probably yes, but then the big question is, can we actually see this in real data and can we quantify it? So how did we go about this? As I mentioned, this like research that really precedes what we have done here by a decade or even more than that, is that I'll start by the right. We have social network data for the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the US. From Twitter, which, well, back then it was Twitter in the good old days. And also back then, this was at a time, so we're talking about a data set from 2012, 2013. This was at a time when by default, your tweets were geolocated and geolocalized. And in that way, this is really a gigantic data set that our colleagues have worked with and that they have preprocessed in a way that we both know from this like gigantic data set of tweets that are geolocated. We know who tweeted them. We know the geolocation of the person as they were tweeting. And so in that way, one could estimate the home location of each person and also the work location. So basically for each user in this gigantic Twitter data set, we know where they live, or well, we can estimate where they live on a quite fine-grained scale. And at the same time, what we also have as information is data on mutual followership on Twitter. And this is what we use as a proxy for social connections, which admittedly, it might not be the best proxy because just the fact that we follow each other on Twitter, it might not necessarily mean that there is a real friendship between us, but this is as good as it gets for us in terms of balancing out what kind of data set where we're able to access without having to pay for it. And also what kind of data can, like on this large scale, meaningfully represent a good proxy for social connection. So yeah, just keep in mind that, of course, we're not talking about real life social networks. We don't have data on that. And of course, it would be interesting to replicate the study with some data set that is maybe even more closely related to social connections in real life. But let's just, you know, assume for the purpose of this talk, at least, that this proxy is an acceptable one. Okay, so this is how we have social networks that are located in space in a way that for all the people that we have in our data set, we know where they live and we know with whom they have social connections, as in with whom they have mutual followership on Twitter. Okay. And then, so we have this social network that is somehow located in space. And then on the other side, we have the spatial networks. And here in particular, what we're interested in is the network of highways or like freeways that really go through the cities. And this is data that was available to us from OpenStreetMap. So this is a crowdsourced data set of street networks across the world. And so we have these two data sets, the spatial network of highways and the social network for the 50 largest US cities. And now the question is, how can we test our hypothesis whether the highways, so the network on the left, impacts the social network, so the network on the right? And for that, we came up with a null model to explain how it works. So I'm starting here with the real data. And let's say that each dot is a Twitter user, and then between the home location of the Twitter user, and then we're drawing just B-lines between two users every time that there is a mutual Twitter followership. And then we have these social ties located in space. And then we have the highway, that's in red. And now we can count how often the social ties, so the real social ties, are crossing this highway segment that we see here. So like we just draw, you know, the black lines that are the B lines. We count the highway crossings and we get to a total number of 94 crossings for this particular highway segment and for this particular exploit of the social network. Okay, so that's the real data. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to rewire the data So for each social tie, we look at the distance between the two users that we're looking at here now. And then we just try to place a new tie in the same distance, so with the same radius. Of course, we can't have, like, it's a bit complicated to do exactly the same distance. So instead of a very specific radius, we have kind of a buffer. So this is indicated in gray. And we're just trying to randomize the social network by rewiring as many social ties as possible. If we don't have any other option, we just keep the real tie. So it's kind of conservative in that sense, one could say. And we do this for all social ties. And so what we get is then a fully randomized social network where, however, the number of connections for each node, also for each user, is preserved. And also the distance distribution of how far away your friends in the randomized network live, it's also preserved. And then after that, we just do exactly the same exercise again. So we draw all the B-lines, and then we count the number of times that these social connections now in the randomized network cross the highway segment. And in this case, for example, we get to 152 crosses, so a higher number of highway crossings. Okay. And now with these two numbers, it's, yeah, there's just one little final step to get to an actual quantification of how much the highway impacts the social connections, which is we're comparing, and this is now the barrier score, BI, for this highway segment that we see. We're comparing how many times does the social network cross the highway in the randomized versus in the real network. And then we normalize by the number of crossings in the real network. So then in this case, for example, we get a number of plus 62%. So a higher number, a higher barrier score. So a barrier score that's positive. And that means that in the randomized network, we see more crossings than in the real network. And if you flip this around now, we can understand that in the real data, we have less highway crossings from the social ties that we would expect if the social ties in the randomized model were not impacted by the highways at all. So if they had no spatial information at all, yeah, we would get more crossings, meaning that as a positive barrier score indicates that the highway segment that this barrier score is attached to is somehow negatively impacting the number of social ties. So it makes it less likely that social ties cross this segment. And this is what the barrier score kind of quantifies. Okay. So this is the general idea of the null model. Then, of course, we ran it many times. We average over, I think, 20 in total model outcomes for each city. And that's how it works. I will now jump directly to what we got as results for the 50 cities that we analyzed. And by the way, I should have said before, but I'll say it now. If there are any questions, you're actually very welcome to interrupt me, so I don't have to talk for 45 minutes straight. But of course, I'm also happy to take like more in-depth questions at the end. But yeah, if there's anything unclear, just feel free to shout out. So yeah, that was the null model. That's how we quantify the barrier score. And I should say this is the number that is attached to the highway segments. So this score is attached to each highway segment. And it's a way to quantify actually the impact on the social ties of the infrastructure that we're looking at. Okay, and now we can jump to, okay, this is a bit, yeah, of a kind of very detailed figure. I'm going to zoom in just in a little bit into the upper part of this figure. But yeah, and then I'm going to walk you through what we actually see here, because that's really a lot of information in one figure. Okay, so each row here is a city. So you see we have 50 cities. And then each column, we have 20 columns. So these are distance bins for the social ties, and they are in steps of 500 meters. So the first two columns are from 0 to 500 meters and from 500 meters to 1 kilometer and so on. So we go in total over all columns through distance bins from 0 to 10 kilometers. And those are the bins. So what we have binned here are the social ties. And then the size of each box represents the number of social ties that we have in each of the bins. And now the color, and this is now the important message actually here, is the value of the barrier score. And so a blue color would indicate a negative barrier score, and the red color would indicate a positive barrier score. So as you maybe now remember from the null model, what I was showing you was something with a positive barrier score. So positive barrier score meaning highways that negatively impact social connections. And of course, yeah, the big message here, and what you see that for all 50 cities and across almost all distance bins, we see red everywhere. We see, of course, like red in different shades. And we see also like different sizes of boxes. So not in all bins do we have the same number of social ties and so on. And we do have a couple of slightly negative values for the highways, especially when we go to larger distances. But the overall trend, and this is also the last column that you see. So the last column is just the numbers summed up over all the distance bins. You see that for the citywide barrier score, we actually have a positive barrier score for, if you sum it up over the entire city, for all 50 US metropolitan areas that we looked into. So this is quite a strong outcome, actually. And again, keep in mind, as I was mentioning, the social data proxy, the social network proxy that we're using might even not be the best one that we have, but even in the mutual Twitter followerships, what you see that is actually the negative impact of highways, of the actual physical infrastructure impacting how likely it is that we find a connection between two people living on two different sides of the same highway. So yeah, quite impressive results, I would say.
Sorry to interrupt, but there's
Yes.
a clarification question in the chat. I can read it to you.
Yes.
So the question from Guang Yuan, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. Any specific reasons for choosing 10 kilometers, just only considering like 0 to 10 for all the cities, since the different cities might have different coverage areas, like different in size and everything.
Yes, thank you for the question. I do have some backup slides for that, actually. So maybe after the talk, if I don't forget, I will show you a bit more about this. If I forget, please do remind me. General answer being depending on which distance bin you zoom in onto for the same highway, you will get very different results. So if you look only at the social connections that are very close to each other, so let's say just a couple of kilometers, then highways tend to have very high barrier scores. But if you look at social connections that are between users that are very far away from each other, then highways have actually a connecting effect. So what we're saying here is that if we zoom in on the distances that we typically see in cities and that people also would be able to, let's say, walk or cycle or do by public transport, then this is where we see the effect. Then, of course, if you, the further you zoom out and the more far away places you consider and the more, let's say, the more longer range social ties you include, then the more, you will get contrary effects. So what you do see, of course, is starting, I think, from a distance of, 25 kilometers. And this is actually also kind of correlating with a lot of previous studies that also have used large scale phone data and so on, that highways actually become connecting for those people who live further away from each other. Yeah, as it's to be expected, because then, of course, that's the way that you have to go from point A to point B in those places.
Just another follow-up question. So the empty bins, like the bins that we see no color, does that mean there were no significant differences or zero effect?
Yes, thank you. So where you see nothing, so that's excluding the bins where we see no statistical significance in the findings. Yes. So everything you see here is statistically significant. If you don't see something, that's because it's not. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Thanks for the distance question. And as I mentioned, remind me again to show you then in the end the follow-ups, the backup slides and that. But yeah, so these are, let's say, the big quantitative results that I wanted to show you. And now, however, I would like to jump to something more specific on the ground, let's say, and to also ask, so what does this actually mean for people in those places? And what we have done in our case is also look into the, let's say, historical context of highway construction in the US and how this actually impacted, urban life in US cities. And for this, we have to say, the topic of segregation is one that quite quickly comes up once you start doing a little bit of literature research. And it's very interesting because, of course, segregation is something that is multidimensional, can happen across a lot of socioeconomic variables. However, and I think this is also an important point to make, in this specific context, because we're working here with US data and with US highways that have been constructed in the 1950s and 1960s, primarily, So there's actually a very clear racial subtext to the whole topic, because back then the US government was actually, and this has been shown over and over and again by a lot of scholars before us. So again, also we're not the first ones to claim this, obviously. So we're just like, following up on thoughts that has been there already before, but highway construction has been used as a policy instrument to actually segregate cities on purpose. And so that's something that we also wanted to look into to understand how also the social political meaning of when highways were constructed, what they were actually used for, is kind of this two-in-one policy instrument. How this actually correlates with the numbers that we find even nowadays in our data. And so maybe as a little intro, I wanted to play you a video. Let's see if this works now. It's just 1 minute, and that's James Baldwin from the 1960s, an interview on TV where he was asked about urban renewal being, like back then, of course, also like this overarching code word for, building highways and really adapting cities to be more car friendly, to put it like that. So I'm going to play the video now, and just interrupt me if the sound doesn't work. Oops, no. Nothing up here.
A boy last week who was 16 in San Francisco told me on television. Thank God we got him to talk. Maybe somebody will start to listen. He said, I got no country, I've got no flag. Now he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. Now we're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or some abstraction called the Negro problem. These are Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says, don't feel they have any place here, on the basis of the performance of the entire country.
But now, Jim...
No, am I exaggerating?
No, I certainly could not say that you're exaggerating.
Yes, so that excerpt ends here. And I think it was, it was also relevant for me to let somebody else who actually knows the US context much better speak before I dive into all of this. But so what we did here, following up on the quantitative analysis that we have, is we looked for 9 of the 50 cities that we looked into, specifically into those where, so the first row where it says, the first column where it says top 3 barrier scores. So those are the top 3 cities that we have found have the highways with the highest barrier scores. So the highways that are most separating, let's say, within those 3 cities. So that's Cleveland, Orlando, and Milwaukee. And then from, again, the qualitative research we did, we found, let's say, 2 kind of different, sometimes complementary cases or examples of how highways have actually been used as a segregating policy instrument. Second column being interracial barriers. So that's where cities where it is historically known that highways have been built on purpose to separate different population groups. And then third column, the intraracial barriers. So again, those are cases where we know historically that the highways have been used to actually disrupt mostly majority Black neighborhoods. And so that's how we identified the 9 case studies. And I will not have that much time to go into all of them, unfortunately, but then again, in the appendix to the paper, so this one is actually available without, not behind the paywall, so you can just find it. We have more detailed, also historical analysis for these 9 cities. But I wanted to show you today, maybe just for 2 of them. So that's going to be Detroit and Nashville. A little bit of in more detail how the history and our numbers somehow connect. And I'll start with Detroit. So this is now a bit of a zoomed in plot in the city center of Detroit. And you see again, the highways with the barrier scores, and the red ones are the ones where barrier scores are positive. So separating people and negatively impacting social connection. And then what you see, so these dotted areas, those are in this case, the areas that back then in 2012, so we're talking like when the social data was collected, the upper quartile of the Black population in this case was living, so by residential area. And then the numbers are M10, I-94, I-75. Those are a couple of like famous/infamous highways that go through the city center of Detroit and have, when they were built, somehow majorly impacted the city. And you also see 8 Mile Road, which I don't need, I think, to explain that much. So that's kind of became proverbial and has also a very high barrier score. But I want to especially draw your attention to Black Bottom and Paradise Valley and West Side. So these are 3 neighborhoods that were majoritarily Black and that were before the highway construction started, so in the 1950s, and before that, very actually successful and thriving neighborhoods that really got disrupted really badly by the highway construction. And I found some aerial view. So in the picture here, so that's from 1956, so before the highway construction started. And there's like a false tone version of the image just for you to see a bit better, because this is actually somebody had drawn with a yellow marker. Maybe if you squint a bit, you can see it. Somebody has drawn on it with a yellow marker, just the shapes of what the highway is going to look like. And approximately in the middle of the picture, you see that there's like this highway intersection, a gigantic one. And it's, yeah, you can see it a bit better with the false colors. But yeah, so there the city has been planning to really put the highway through this neighborhood and disrupt it completely. And again, so Black Bottom, again, you see on the left side, 1949, this was the area that really got lost completely. And you see, again, an aerial view of the same area today. You see downtown Detroit, and it's kind of completely overtaken by this gigantic highway intersection. And since you have the river on the other side, really, not only is it completely squeezed in, but also like there's no access to that area anymore. And yeah, one last, I think kind of powerful image to look at is, so this is again, historically the red-lined areas of Detroit. And then on the right, you see that the highways actually follow quite neatly those redlining patterns. So not a coincidence. And yeah, so then with that context, again, if you look one more time at how then also the highways that have been added to Black Bottom in this case have a very high barrier score. Of course, we cannot be talking correlation and causality here, but definitely, yeah, there's something in the bush there about where exactly these highways were placed. It was not coincidental. And then the impacts of it are seen until today in the social networks, which is, yeah, kind of mind-blowing. And the second example that I wanted to show you is from Nashville. And here, this is, I also put all the links, and then maybe if one or the other of you is particularly interested in the history, then you can like go and read the articles as well that are super interesting. So Nashville is actually a fascinating case because that was the first case in US history where highway construction was actually halted by a court order on base of discrimination. And in the end, they proceeded and they lost in federal court. So in the end, the highway was constructed, but it was a kind of historical win for the first time that actually people have been taken seriously in the protest against the highways that were being constructed. And the picture you see here is from the Nashville I-40 Steering Committee. And this is an initiative that formed in the 1970s and based on NGOs and just individual residents of the area that I'm going to show you the next slide where they were living, where they could see that the plans of the government to construct the highway through that area were really disrupting to the neighborhood. And yeah, so they went to court, they protested, and something, if not success in the end, that something came out of it. So kind of a famous court case. And the area we were talking about is Jefferson Street. So that you see now in the image highlighted with this brown box, like approximately where it was located. And then what you see, the I-40, as it is routed through Nashville and through the city center of Nashville, you can see that it doesn't really follow, like, also now we don't have the base map below it, but there would have been a bit more of an intuitive way of routing I-40 more with a curve that is less S-shaped, you see? So I-40 has this weird kink, okay, in the middle. And this weird kink, it just so happens that it goes exactly through Jefferson Street, which again, back then it was a bustling Black business and commercial neighborhood. So there were a lot of Black businesses on Jefferson Street that got, I think then somebody tried to quantify, it's like 80% of the businesses were either completely destroyed by the highway construction, like the Black-owned businesses, or just severely disrupted because the entire commercial area was cut in two. And yeah, so of course, again, one cannot claim causation and correlation, but of course it raises a lot of questions and flags when you see that the routing as it has been planned really goes exactly through that area, completely disrupting it, and not alongside the, not further north, not further south, but exactly through there. And also cutting, kind of separating from each other, 3 different higher education institutions, like 3 different universities that were located on different sides of the I-40, and also majoritarily Black. So again, not a lot of consideration, to say the least, for how this highway construction would impact the population in the city. And again, as we see here, also in the quantitative data of social connections, you see the effects of the highway really disrupting the social fabric up to today. So as we were writing this article, then we were kind of pleased to see that there was this Reconnecting Communities program financed by the Biden administration. So this is an article that is a little bit over a year old, as you see. So this is from March 2024. So there was a kind of a big lump of money allocated to this Reconnect Communities program, where in the description of the program, they actually acknowledge how highway construction, I mean, they don't talk about only highways, but also quite a lot about highways and how highways have really impacted US cities and how they want to reconnect communities, as in, finance measures that will somehow mitigate this disrupting effects that highways brought into different US cities. And a lot of projects have started to get funding through that. So I just brought one example that's like maybe just because I could find like a nice visualization of what we're talking about here in terms of how to reconnect communities, quote unquote. This is from Portland, the I-5 Rose Border Improvement Project, where what you see on the left is like what it looks like right now. So you have a gigantic highway again, and what they're suggesting and what they want to get funding from the government for is to have a cap, so to cover the highway in a way that the 2 neighborhoods on both sides of the highway become actually connected by walkable infrastructure, let's say. And so to have the highway, the gigantic one, go underground in that place, which also then would give for new area, like new land area added to the city. However, and again, so these are breaking news from just last week, I think, April 29th. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, but not less scandalous because of that, Trump administration decided to cut funding and freeze all funding, so like withdrawing all the money allocated to this program. And I am not a US citizen, but if you are, or if you do live in the US and you feel like something could be done about it, I circled there are 2 links to 2 different petitions. Maybe that's the least thing you can do. The first one is signatures from organizations. The second one is a tool where you can also like urge your representative to do something about it. So there are some people organizing to protest also against money being taken away from those initiatives. And I think this already brings me to the take-home messages from today. The first one being, of course, already in the title of our paper, as we found, urban highways are indeed barriers to social ties. So this is the quantitative, if you want, a demonstration of it. So go read the paper. And also, I think maybe more importantly, it's never too late to change that. And that's also what I wanted to conclude with. And then if you have any follow-up questions, or as I mentioned, if you want a PDF version of the paper, you're very welcome to reach out to me. And with that, I'll open the floor for questions.
All right, thanks so much. This was amazing, really interesting. I do have a couple questions, but I just want to give time to our audience if they have any. And I also wanted to remind you about the backup slides and the question related to the distance choice. So just keep that in mind.
Maybe I can start with I'm going to start with the distance choice since I'm already on the slides, and then we can take the rest of the questions. And let me just, So I think here what you can see is that, I just need to remind myself, so this is from the appendix. So this is 3 times the same place, but we're considering different types of ties. So in frame A, we're only considering ties up to 5 kilometers. And then for those, if we only look at social ties up to 5 kilometers, you see that the values are highly positive. So kind of very much disruptive. So highways are disruptive for these short distance ties. Then when we only consider long distance ties between 15 and 20 kilometers, so that's kind of B, then you see that actually if we only consider those, then the highways all have blue, so negative scores, so kind of connecting, let's say. And then again, if we really consider all tides that we have in our data set, and that's panel C, then some of the highways have positive, while some of the highways have negative barrier scores. So of course, it really depends on the granularity and the scale that you're looking at. But it also intuitively makes sense because different social connections with different distances will also be, differently traveled, let's say, by people. And let me just check. I think, yes, I think this was the main distance point I had. Okay, and now I'm ready for the other questions.
Okay, I think I'll go first while people are still thinking about coming up with good questions, maybe. So I'm just wondering, like, do you have any insights into what might predict like different like barrier scores that we see? Because at the like when you look at the top of that like list of cities with highest like barrier scores, the top 10, for example, there were all sorts of like different cities in terms of like different characteristics and like in terms of size, population, and all of that. So I was like by just like yeah, getting a glimpse of it, I wasn't able to like see, okay, yeah, these kind of cities seem to have like these kind of like issues more so than the others. So do you have a like, yeah, any kind of like insight into what sorts of like different traits could predict that?
Yeah, that's a great question, really. I think it's very difficult to answer because I think to target that, one would need to somehow come up with a classification of cities, of how to classify them, and also classification on the nature of the social network, I would say. I can add, so this is maybe only tangential, but we did control for census tract level, income levels, and difference in major majority racial group in each census. And also we run some experiments where we control for whether the number of highways and the total length of highways and so on all have an impact. So we did control for that. And even when you control for all these variables, the barrier score is still a real thing, so to speak. So we still see the number. But this, yeah, as I said, this is only tangential. My intuition would be that it really depends a lot on how people move in cities, whether this, like, how big the impact will be on a local level. That's one thing, and we did not have data on that, so we couldn't look into this. And then at the same time, of course, highways are only one of many factors that somehow impact the social fabric, right? So I would not dare to take our list of 50 cities and say, okay, let's do some classification based on only the barrier score that we computed. I think that's interesting to consider just on the level of if we talk about highways. But if what we're actually interested in is not the highways, but the social fabric and like what increases or decreases the likelihood of people being friends or just even knowing each other, then I think highways are just one of many aspects. And then, yeah, so it goes in different directions. And one last thing to add, I think, is that on just anecdotically, but also I think sociologically often proven, is that what one creates in one's mind when you navigate urban space is actually kind of mental map where you have barriers that are not necessarily based on distance, but really based on this is neighborhood A and this is neighborhood B. And what separates the two of them, it can be a physical barrier, but it can be also just an invisible kind of mental barrier that's where you know, okay, this neighborhood ends here, this neighborhood starts here, and you allocate different, mental categorizations to them. So I think there's like a psychological element also playing quite a big role. But yeah,
no, definitely agree because I live right by a giant highway and like literally like probably a couple 100 feet away from the 405 highway in Los Angeles. And then just in my mind, like the other side of the highway is like completely placed completely different than where I'm at. Even just like right there, like it's the same thing. And like even the university housing that I live in has a like symmetrical portion of the same like apartment complex on the other side of the highway. So it's like we're actually connected, but not really. It's kind of, it's really weird. Okay, so we have a question in the chat. I can read it to you. So given that many Latin American cities also have urban highways that divide neighborhoods, how might the findings of this study inform more equitable and socially cohesive urban planning in the region? And where urban freeways have also historically been used to divide communities and prioritize vehicular transportation over pedestrian and social needs. So Xiomara, I think like speaks to the fact that like the same also appear in Latin America as well. So I think it's like, great question. I mean, how do we mitigate this really? Like, given the fact that like we are highly dependent on all these like infrastructures and like it's so costly to actually just like get rid of them or rebuild them in a equitable way, I guess.
Yes. Thanks a lot for this question as well. I think it would be super interesting to see whether the findings replicate in other places, of course. If we only had the data, then we would love to do that. And of course now, I mean, all the code is open sourced and the null model is, I think, feasible to just rewrite for the type of data that you might have for cities in Latin American countries, for example. So it would be super cool, of course, to look into, just the same mathematical framework but applied to different locations. What I will say is that I think in the end, I mean, it's all nice and well with all these numbers, but I think in the end, when it comes to really sitting down with urban planners to talk about, we have all this infrastructure cemented kind of, right, already in place, and which, if we want to mitigate them, where should we start? I think that the numbers that we compute here should not be the first answer, but you should rather look at, what's actually going on the ground and which communities are the most disadvantaged or the most impacted by the highways, and then go by that. So I do think that we have very interesting and strong results in terms of, highways have an impact on social fabric. I don't think that this directly should translate into any policy, because what you first would want to look at is, which are the places in the city that are really negatively impacted by highway construction? How can we help there? So I think it's always a question of priority. And it's also a question of political will. As we've seen in the US, political will is changing, right? And maybe a bit less there now than it was in the past. So there, for example, now in the US, the problem is not even how should we do it, but how do we convince people that we actually need to do it? And the numbers might help, but the numbers in themselves are not enough for that, right?
Laura, please go. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering whether you can combine your initial map of roads and highways by including public transportation and integrate that in your measures so as to compare whether this, let's call it mitigation factor, modifies your barrier index or not.
Yes, that's a very interesting suggestion. And I think a way to go about it would be, because now for the social ties, what we do now is we are just drawing a beeline, right, between point A and point B. And then we use that as distance. We also try to use walking distance as routed through OpenStreetMap as a proxy. But then we found that walking distance or beeline distance, they kind of give the same results. So we went with the easier one. But I do think that it might be very interesting, and that's how I think I would integrate it, what you're suggesting. Instead of looking just at the beeline and then the distance in meters from A to B, one could look at the time it takes you to get by public transport from A to B. So then you would be quantifying, so then you would not have distance bins, but time bins, right? So the longer it takes to get from A to B by public transport, then that's how you order your ties, and that's how you could look into the mitigating impact of public transport. It's a great idea, actually. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
So the person who asked the question about the Latin American cities just followed up with this comment. They're saying, it is true, there's no construction planning, and in the capital cities, there's a lot of informality, especially in the outskirts. Okay, do we have any other questions from the audience? If not, I have a practical question. Oh, yeah, I think there's a follow-up question by Laura, or maybe not.
No, it's just a mistake. That's not the right
Oh,
thing.
okay. All right. So I think like, yeah, what I'm wondering is, I mean, you already talked about it, but like, yeah, we had Twitter as a like huge data source back in the days. Now it's not there anymore, right? So then like for people, I mean, even that like it doesn't have to be specifically about this topic, but like, yeah, we don't really have a reliable data source that we can have like information about social ties, but also like some geotag like data as well, so that we can study like cool stuff like this. So like, what do we do? Like, I'm not aware of any other like big reliable data sources that is like suitable for this kind of research. But yeah, what do you think on that?
Yes, good question. I mean, I know there are some sources that either if you pay, then you get the data, for example, from Meta, let's say, like all the Facebook data that one could potentially work with. Then for that, of course, you need a lot of money. And then again, it's like a social network that is online. So that again is biased towards certain segments of the population who use these platforms more and so on. So I think there's a kind of bias that you'll never get rid of. And then another type of studies that we have seen quite a lot are using mobile phone data. But then, of course, depending on your level of agreement with the companies that provide this data, you can know more or less about the person and the individual. And then in the end, yeah, it's a pity, but at the same time, I'm kind of happy that it's not completely out there, all the data on all the population about where we live and who we talk to. And actually, I mean, as a researcher, it's of course would be great to have all this data, but as a private person, I'm just happy that we do have some privacy left somehow, even though maybe less than we think. But yeah, I think every time that we said about not being able to do a research project at the same time, maybe we can be happy about, okay, but I'm not being surveilled to that extent yet. And then what I can also say is that in a couple of, like, this is like very specific to Northern Europe. I know that in a couple of countries here, there's really a lot of, like actually on state level, the level of data that the state has on each individual, it's kind of, yeah, mind-blowingly well organized, let's say. And for example, some of my colleagues in Netherlands and also in Denmark, they have been doing studies where, so they know from the census data, so from the registration, sorry, not census, what is it called? When you register where you live, like your home location registration that you have to keep updated. In that way, they are able to track not only where a person lives, but also who they live with and where each of these individuals work and where they get education. And so in this data set, what you can actually see are all the social ties of we've been to the same class at university, we've been to the same high school, our kids go to the same kindergarten. All of that is like information you could get from there, which doesn't tell you about our kids are friends in kindergarten or our kids actually hate each other in kindergarten, but it tells you something about like social context that has been shared. Yeah, so in some countries, census data are actually also available for that.
Cool. All right. Yeah, thanks so much for the answer. Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we'll just end here. But if you have any questions, just yeah, this is your moment to like ask him. But yeah, thanks so much for this talk. It was really amazing. Especially, I really enjoyed the last part that you walked us through the different case studies of like, yeah, like I mean, obviously we cannot claim anything causal because we don't know like whether those barriers were already there, whether that like separation was already existent or not before the implementation of the highways or whatever. Like we don't have historical like social tie data, obviously. But I mean, it's yeah, I buy that story. What you were telling me, yeah, there are like strong reasons to believe in what you were saying. I think so. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Anastassia, again, being here for the great talk. We'll see everyone, like whoever wants to join for the last talk of this season, 2 weeks from now, with Isabella Aguiar from the Santa Fe Institute. Yeah, this is it. Thank you. Have a great one, everyone.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.